and thank you.
Hello, everybody. First, I want to thank the organization for having invited me to give this talk. And thank you all for coming. I'm Ramon Pinuaga, and I'm going to talk about FileLess malware and what lesson can we learn from this kind of malware for doing penetration testing or hacking in general. So this is a small summary of what we're going to view. First, I'm going to present what is FileLess malware, or what can we consider FileLess malware. Then we are going to view some real-world examples, and how can we build a penetration testing process based on this kind of techniques. So I am Ramon Pinuaga, as I told before, and I work as Pentester. I was working as Pentester for many years. I currently work for PROSEGUR. PROSEGUR is a traditional physical security company, but it's also doing cybersecurity now. And I'm Spanish. I work for PROSEGUR there. And I prefer the offensive side of cybersecurity, so this talk is more focused on the offensive side, but the talk have a lot of implication for the blue team for how to detect this kind of attacks. So first, what is a FileLess malware? A FileLess malware is a malicious code that doesn't need to create or to drop files on a system. That kind of malware tries to move away from the traditional malware, traditional binary or monolithic malware. And this kind of malware always, for persistent, this kind of malware always need to create something or to leave something on the system. But this can be very small or very high for difficulty in its detection. So I have mentioned that it's malware that move away from the traditional, from the regular way of working of malware, moving away from using regular files, but in a computer system, almost everything ends up in a file. So we are talking about not using regular files. For example, most of the techniques we are going to view hide things in the registry. In a Windows system, in the registry of a Windows system, hides things there. The registry is in a file, but it's a very big file. It's a very complex file, so nobody's going to upload this file to VirusTotal or are going to scan this kind of big files. So when we are speaking about FileLess malware, we have two types of techniques for doing so. We can not use code or malware at all. For example, we can modify the configuration of a system without leaving any file or anything on the system. But with this configuration, we can backdoor the system, so we can access the system later. So it's like installing a backdoor. A bit louder? Let's try. I have a bit of a code. We can try to not use malware at all, not use code. And we also can use code, but we can use code that never touches disk. We can hide this code in some places that are not files. And we can obfuscate, we can hide this code from the security tools. So we have two different types of techniques. Why malware is every day we see more this kind of techniques, this kind of malware, and this is why security tools are getting better. So malware tries to evolve to avoid detection, and why these kind of techniques are interesting in pen testing. So for the same reason, if we are not using file, we can try to evade antivirus because most antivirus or security tools depend on scanning a file or scanning something for detection. So if we don't have files, we don't have anything to scan, we don't have anything to upload to a sandbox. We don't have anything to upload to VirusTotal. So that way, working without files, we are difficulting the detection. Working without files is also convenient for leaving a smaller forensic trail. We leave less things on the system, so we complicate the work for forensic analysts. These kind of techniques are also useful in difficult environments where the installation of new things is restricted, environments when it's hard to upload new things. So if we are working without files, we can work in this kind of environment. And this kind of techniques are also useful in bypassing application whitelisting solutions, because we are not working with files. Application whitelisting solution usually work by blacklisting or whitelisting some types of binaries of files. If we are not working with files, it's easy for us to bypass this kind of technique to work in this kind of environment. Most of these techniques are useful for almost any kind of environment, but I'm focused more on Windows system. That is the most habitual environment in penetration testing, but some techniques are also useful for hacking Linux or other kind of systems. So we are trying to, in this talk, we are going to use the techniques used in FileLess malware for doing penetration testing. But most of the malware that we are going to use as example is malware from an APT operation. It's advanced malware. But APT is not the same as penetration testing. In penetration testing, we have big differences with an APT. Usually, penetration testing is carried out in a short frame of time. We have a small period of time to do the pen test. On the contrary, APT operations usually are long term. Usually, in pen testing, we don't need to stay in a system a lot of time. We usually don't need only a couple of days of persistence, or sometimes we don't even need persistence. In a pen test engagement, we have a scope, and we have a target, and we try to get to that target the quickly as possible. On the contrary, APT operations usually are long term, and the attackers try to stay on the system more time. So from the lessons we are going to learn from APT operations or from FileLess malware, we are going to only use the more simple or the more effective. For the same reason, usually in pen testing, we don't need access to the kernel of the system. We prefer simple techniques. So usually we don't use rootkit, bootkit, or advanced infection techniques. A lot of time because the scope of the engagement doesn't allow us to do this kind of things. On the contrary, APT operation usually want this kind of access to have a better hiding, to have a more degree of stealthiness. So, of all the techniques we are going to view, when apply these techniques to pen testing, we try to use the more simple or the more effective one. So usually we stay in user land. We don't use rootkit, bootkit, or advanced infection technique, and we are not using NSA-like implants or so advanced. So in this talk, we are going to focus on simple and easy to carry out techniques. And I have a video for showing you one of these techniques. It's a very common trick for penetration testing. And let me stop this. Can you see the screen? Let me make it bigger. It's not very clear. Well, I can explain you more or less. In this technique, we are going to combine we are going to create a backdoor on a system without creating any file. And we are, I don't know if we can have some zoom here. No, it's not. It's a full screen, it's not. I can do it bigger. Well, after the talk, I'm going to hang this video in YouTube. You can review it. But I'm going. We are going to combine two techniques for backdooring a system without creating any file. First, I'm going to. We are combining the terminal service that is available in all Windows, the remote desktop, with the hijacking of the sticky case binary. The sticky case binary in Windows is a binary that starts when you hit uppercase 5 times. And it works everywhere in Windows, even when the user is not logged in. So we are going to activate, it's not very easy to see, but I'm modifying 2 registry keys to activate remote desktop on the system. And by modifying one entry in the registry Windows, I'm hijacking the sticky case binary, and I'm replacing it by the cmd.exe, the Windows shell. So when I hit the upper key 5 times, it will start a Windows command and not the sticky case binary. So I have activated the remote desktop. I have changed also for hiding the backdoor. I have changed the TCP port where remote desktop listens for using another port. And after that, I am restarting the service. And also, I need to open the Windows firewall, the port 444 in the Windows firewall. So I have configured that backdoor only by modifying 3 registry entries. And from a Windows system, I only need to connect to this port, the 444, and open a remote desktop connection. I don't have any credential nor username. And I hit the uppercase key 5 times, and I have a shell. So with only 3 registry keys, I can backdoor a system in a way that I don't create any file, I don't modify any file on the system. And this backdoor has the additional feature that as there is no user logged in, the shell is open as system. So I have full control of the Windows system, and without creating any file. So I am not going to be detected by any antivirus on most security tools. It leaves a small forensic trail, so it's hard to detect and to prevent. And with 3 simple commands, I have installed a backdoor on a system. So this is the idea of this kind of techniques. So what are the challenges of a FileLess malware? A FileLess malware needs to achieve 2 things. FileLess malware needs to keep code, to hide code in a part of the system. It can't create files, so we need to keep our code in other places. And we need to execute that code. We need a first stage to launch that malware. So we have 2 challenges. How do we keep code without files? So we have a lot of different places to choose. For example, we can keep the code in memory. Some famous malware families use this kind of hiding. The problem with this, with keeping all the code in memory and not keeping anything on disk, is that we don't have persistence. So it only works in high uptime system. If the system reboots, we lost the malware. So we have another techniques to solve that. We can also store the code in non-file or non-regular file storage. For example, the registry, as I said before, the registry is a typical place where malware hides, or malware can hide. So where we can hide code that is not the file system. For example, we can hide code outside the file system, in the UEFI, in the HDD firmware, in hidden these areas. But for this kind of hiding, we need rootkit capabilities. We can do it from userland. So this kind, for this talk, this kind of hiding is not interesting. What other places we can use for hiding code? For example, we can store code in the cloud, in the network, and make that our first stage downloads this code. It's not a perfect solution because the system can be isolated or can lose the network connection, but we can try to do that. Another place where a lot of malware tries to hide, this is a traditional place for hiding, it's in the metadata of the file system. In an NTFS file system, we have what we call ADS, alternate data stream, this metadata associated with a file, and we can hide the malware there. And there are a lot of families of malware that use this technique for hiding. These techniques are used by a lot of malware families, and it's more traditional. It's more watched by antivirus and security tools. But we have another more new ways of non-regular storage. For example, it's very common in new waves of APT groups to use WMI, Windows Management Interface subscription, for hiding and for executing code. This subscription lets us to store code in the Windows system that is not in any file. So it's a good way for hide code. We can also use the Windows event files to hide code. Each Windows event have a field where we can store code, and we can call that code later. This .ebt are also files, but are big files, and almost no security tool scan this kind of file. So we can keep code hidden in this event. Another option is hide code in Office documents, doc files, PDF files. I'm not talking about infecting via a Word macro, a macro virus. I'm talking only about using legit files that are already in the system for hiding malicious code inside of these files. This is not a very good option for hiding code because these files are, because these kind of files are nowadays one of the main ways of infections. They are usually very controlled, very watched by antivirus and security software, but sometimes we can use it for storing code. Not for infection, but for hiding things inside of them. And we have more new techniques. For example, we can use the space that we have in file or the directory names, or the space we have in environment variables to keep code inside of this. We can chunk our payload in small chunks, and we can store this code in these places. In file or directory name, we have 255 bytes of space. We can use a small chunk of code and distribute among different file names. And with environment variables, we have 4096 bytes of space for storing code. So we can store code there. I haven't seen any malware or any proof of concept that use this kind of storage for keeping malware, but it could be done. And I have a small example of this kind of technique. Let's see if this one shows better. Okay. So with going, the screen is not. I'm going to combine some of these techniques. I'm going to backdoor a system, to install a backdoor on a system using three stages. The first stage is going to be in the registry. And what I'm doing is adding a run key in the registry for the malware or for the backdoor to start. And this is the entry. I have created an entry called winlogon that makes a call to the Windows shell cmd.exe and loads what I call stage 2, that is our second stage. This entry is not very stealth, it's a bit noisy. A malware analyst can detect this kind of backdooring, but I am not including any malware or any malicious code in this entry, so antivirus, automated scanner, security scanner are going to be difficult to detect this kind of backdooring. So the first stage is very small and very simple, and can pass undetected. So this is our first stage. The second stage, I'm going to include it in an environment variable. In Windows, I can create persistent environment variables, like in Linux. And I'm going to create an environment variable with this name called stage 2. And this environment variable contains a small chunk of PowerShell code. I have this second stage, which is a very simple PowerShell, only a line of PowerShell. And what this code does is reading the content. GCI is get content of this folder. There is a folder in the desktop called demo. And we call the code that is stored in this folder. So we have created only one registry entry and one environment variable. So I'm going to log out and log in again to check if the backdoor is working. And the backdoor that I have created for this demo is a simple Metasploit payload that opens a calculator. So I'm logging and I'm logging again, and the backdoor is a simulated backdoor is going to pop up. So let's see. This is the folder demo. This is the folder where the payload is, and here we have the calculator. But let's go to see what is inside this folder. Well, this is the contents of the folder. As you can see, size 0 bytes. There is nothing there. Contains zero files. But here's the trick: 32 folders. There's not completely empty. There are folders in there. So let's see what happens if we open the folder. So the folder is empty. There's nothing here. Somebody can think what is happening. It's a simple trick. I have configured the folder to be hidden. If we configure Windows by default doesn't show the hidden folders. But if we configure the Windows for showing the hidden folder, here is what the real payload is. And the payload is a simple Metasploit payload encoded in base64, but split in chunks that use the names of the folder for containing the malicious code. If we upload these kind of files to VirusTotal, they are empty folders, so there is no detection, and we can keep code hidden in the system without being detected. So we are trying to make the detection of traditional antivirus, traditional security tools more difficult, changing the place where we can store the code. So we have our first challenge, that is where we can keep code. And we have another challenge. How can we load, how can we execute that code that we have stored in these places? We have some option. For example, we can call that code remotely or inject the starting the first stage via an exploit, a remote exploit. But this is not very convenient. If every time I want to reinfect the system, I have to make a remote call, it's not very useful for persistence. So usually we don't have this kind of techniques. Another option is to load our first stage from a remote system, for example, using a remote network share via SMB or via WebDAV. I can configure, for example, an auto-start program that is located in a remote folder. This way, we don't keep anything in this file system. But it's not very useful because a forensic analyst could detect where the initial payload is and have a copy of them. So we have to try other options. And the most common option used by malware that works fileless is to use scripting languages. In the demo that I showed you before, the second stage was a small PowerShell. PowerShell is a very powerful scripting language in Windows, and it's the option that most malware use for doing things. The problem for Pentesters is that the latest version of PowerShell have more security, have more restriction, and generate a lot of Windows events, have more logging capabilities, because PowerShell is the option for most malware creators. So the big Microsoft is including more security features in PowerShell to difficulting this kind of attacks. So PowerShell is not the best option because it's easy to detect. It leaves a lot of forensic trails. So another option is to use the traditional JavaScript or Visual Basic scripting that is integrated in all Windows versions. So we can use this kind of scripts for load as a first stage for our malware. One of the advantages of this kind of scripting is that we can load this kind of scripts from different tools. For example, we can use 3script, we can use MSHT, run the LF32. We can use different binaries for load this kind of scripting. And all these binaries are by default in our Windows versions. So we can choose our way of launching the malware. And another option we have for the first stage of our malware is to use .NET assemblies. .NET assemblies can be loaded remotely, so we can use any of these tools to load a remote binary, a remote .NET assembly for launching our malware. So what's the conclusion? That for creating our fileless penetration framework, usually a penetration testing framework, it's a bunch of tools that when we compromise a system, we upload and we create our toolkit there, and we use that system to attack others. What do we need to create the same type of framework without files, without uploading anything to the system? So we need tools already installed on the system. For example, some of these tools, we need to choose what are the ones we need. And we need to create code to be launched by these tools. We need tools that allows receiving external input. We need tools that work without the need of creating any files or using files on the system. So we need tools that allows us to send input remotely or to send input via the command line. So we don't need any files for working. And as a bonus point, if the tools are signed by Microsoft, or all these tools are created by Microsoft, so are signed. All these tools, if they are signed by Microsoft, it's easy to use them for bypassing, for example, application whitelisting. if we have, excuse me, if we have an application, a whitelist application solution that allows Microsoft application to run, we can use any of these tools to bypass the whitelisting to execute our code. So if the tools are signed, it's the better. Real world examples. I have selected some malware families that are very successful in the field and that are very efficient. And all these tools, all of these malware families work in a fileless way. The concept of fileless malware is not new. We have example of malware that doesn't use files, even in 2003. But it's malware that is not very. They are warm. They are not. They don't have payload. They don't have many functionalities. But there are some examples. One of the first cases of fileless malware that have advanced capabilities is Poweliks. Poweliks is usually recognized as one of the first and most famous fileless malware. And Poweliks opened a door for this kind of malware. Poweliks was a very successful malware family that had a lot of strain, a lot of variants, and was very successful. Poweliks, it was not detected by many antivirus products in months. So it was very successful. And how Poweliks worked? The infection usually was carried out by a word macro, so it was not fully fileless. Excuse me. The infection was carried out using a file, but after that the malware becomes fully fileless. The first stage is a run key. It's a bit noisy, easy to detect, but most antivirus doesn't detect these entries. And after that, the malware first it loaded a JavaScript code, a small chunk of JavaScript code that loaded a PowerShell code that was encrypted and obfuscated in another registry entry, and this PowerShell injected a DLL, a binary malware, a traditional binary malware, in the memory of a legit process. So this is an example. These are the registry keys where the malware hides. This is the initial run DLL load, and this is the second stage, encrypted, so an antivirus tool can detect it. Another successful malware family, fileless malware family, was WMI Ghost. Poweliks was a financially motivated malware, but WMI Ghost is a malware used in APT operation. So WMI Ghost used a different strategy. The infection and deployment of the malware was done using files, so it created some files on the system. But after that, it became fully fileless. So after all the initial files were deleted from the system, the malware created W event definition, W consumers. So it remains in the system in each root, and it doesn't need any type of file. The first stage of the malware was JavaScript, and then it loaded a binary malware. There are some different variants. So the ones we have seen are malware. But in 2015, a group of people created Empire. Empire was one of the first penetration testing framework. It was a remote administration tool, a Trojan to do penetration testing, using fileless techniques. And this tool tries to be as fileless as possible, trying to work always from memory. It's a very complete tool for penetration testing. It has a lot of features. It has a lot of options for persistent storage. it has a lot of options for the loading of the tool. So it's a very good example of FileLess penetration testing kit. And we can end the review of famous malicious malware, FileLess malware, without speaking about Duku. Maybe for the name you don't remember, but Duku 2 was famous for infected Kaspersky. It was a malware used by an EPT group to infect a malware company. And it infected a lot of systems in this company by using FileLess strategies. The malware mainly stays hidden in memory, and only a few selected hosts in the network keep the malware in disk. So it was very hard to detect. And well, the initial infection vector was done by MSI packages, but after that the malware becomes fully fileless. So what lessons can we learn from these malware families? We can learn techniques that allows us to bypass security tools, antivirus, and we can learn from his behavior how can we create a pen testing strategy or a pen testing policy for being undetected or for being more hard to detect. So what is the common fileless malware behavior? Most of this malware has a minimal first stage for making more easy to hide the first stage, for making harder to detect this first stage. And usually they use a small scripting, a small JavaScript or Visual Basic script, and not directly PowerShell, because PowerShell is easier to detect. But these scripting languages doesn't have, for example, capabilities for memory injection. So for doing the memory injection, they usually use a second or third stage based on PowerShell that makes the injection of the main body of the malware. And the third stage, the main functionality of the malware, usually is a traditional binary malware. It's contained in a DLL or an exe file. But this binary never touches disk. It's always encrypted or hidden in a way that it can be detected. So let's build our penetration testing framework using these techniques. First, we need a way for infecting a system without using any files to reduce or to difficult the detection of this kind of files. This is not common. Even the malware families we have seen use files in this phase. So it's not easy to exploit a system without using any files. But there are some exploits that we can use for this kind of infection. For example, we can use exploit that are inside a stream of a protocol that uses streams. We can try to exploit lower network layers like SSL or SMB protocols, or we can try to attack open network services. So we don't need to send any kind of file. We had a perfect example of this kind of exploit this year in Eternal Blue. Eternal Blue, it was almost the perfect fileless exploit. It was an exploit very difficult to detect for security tools. Even after Microsoft published a patch, published the vulnerability, most security tools doesn't detect this kind of exploit. Nowadays, it's a very popular exploit. Nowadays, a lot of tools detect this kind of exploit, but when the exploit was published, most security tools doesn't work with this kind of exploit. And it was the perfect fileless exploit because it injected the payload in the memory of the kernel of the attacked machine without creating any file, without transmitting any file. And it was a direct injection in memory, so it was very, very hard to detect. If we can achieve a FileLess infection, then we need to create a FileLess backdoor. For example, the one I have used in the first video. we can activate a remote access, a remote desktop, for example, and we can hijack some binary that could be open for backdooring the system. We have also the traditional way of creating a backdoor in a system, that is adding a user with administrator capabilities and use this account for launching remote commands. In Windows, we have a lot of options to launch remote command. We can use PSexec-like command execution. We can use WMI. We can use scheduled tasks. We can use WinRemote, PowerShell remoting. That way, we don't create or we don't install anything on the system, and we can access the system later. We can also create silver, golden tickets. We can, and a technique that I like, because it's also very simple and very powerful, is to configure a proxy on the system and to weaken the security of the system. For example, this technique is even possible in an iPhone. An iPhone, it's a very secure, a very restricted environment, most of all in the last version, because Apple restricts a lot what can we install on a phone. It's very hard to install a backdoor, to install a malware in an iPhone, because Apple doesn't allow us. On the exception of if the mobile is jailbroken, that is not very common. But we can modify the configuration. We can, it's very difficult to install a malware, even if we have physical access. But if we have this physical access to the phone, we can change the configuration. We can configure a proxy, so all the IP traffic of the phone goes through a rogue proxy, a malicious proxy. And nowadays, most communication use SSL, are encrypted. So we have to weaken the security of the phone. For example, if we need to inspect SSL traffic, we can install a rogue certificate authority in the phone, so we can do man in the middle of the SSL traffic, so we can decrypt the traffic for the phone. So a very restrictive environment that doesn't allow us to install a backdoor, via configuration modification, we can achieve some kind of backdooring. And the last thing we need in our perfect pentest, fileless pentest operation is installing some kind of persistent. We have some options, most of them using modifying registry auto-start entries. We can create a run entry. We can create a remote scheduled task. We can use WMI. We can create a service. The configuration of a Windows service is also in the registry, so we can create our custom service. Usually, all this kind of persistent is too noisy for a human analyst, but they are very hard to detect with an automated tools if we obfuscate the payload or if we use simple code that doesn't contain a malicious action. So that way we can achieve persistent without creating many detected evidences. So conclusions. We can learn values lesson from this malware, and we can carry full pentest operation with these techniques without using any files or almost any file, and leaving very few or very difficult to detect small chunks of code for persistent. So we are seeing every day more and more malware families that are using this kind of techniques, and in pen testing we are going to be to view more and more these kind of techniques because they are very useful for bypassing security tools. So, question, comments? I'm going to put the videos in YouTube, and I understand that the slides are going to be put online. So, any question? This is my Twitter account. So, thank you.